Hello and welcome to Rule of Carnage, a video series and sometimes podcast where we, some designers of games, talk about the subject of designing better miniature games. I'm Mike. I've designed such games as Gaslands and A Billion Suns, both available from Offspray Games. And I also publish more games through the Blaster magazine, which you can find by searching Blaster Mag. Glenn, who are you?
I'm Glenn Ford. I have published several Kickstarted games. I've worked on A Billion Suns and Gaslands with Mike. I publish a few I started putting out games on Itch and Wargaming Vault now, just to sort of amuse myself. So if you look me up on either of those, you'll see some slightly insane little games that you can pick up and play around with and question yourself as to what on earth I was thinking at the time. But yeah, so we're going to have a little chat today about shooting. Basically, because
shooting is terrible. Don't put it in your game.
I think shooting is generally a bad idea. As a rule of thumb, shooting is probably a bad idea. Certainly, as casually as it is treated by a lot of games and a lot of designers, it's a really bad idea. And I think, if anything, I want to sort of make an impassioned call, if nothing else, for people to be more careful and considerate about the shooting in their game when they put it in. So the reason I think that shooting is bad is there are three reasons I think shooting is generally bad. The first,
you missed the Monty Python introduction of those three reasons, by the way.
Yeah, and also
I'm interested in this because I have a sense of probably where you're going with this, but I definitely don't have an as strongly held yet opinion. And by the end of this episode, I may be filled with the fervor that you feel.
I mean, the first one, and I think probably the most minor problem, is that it just wrecks any realism of scale. You know, if you have a game that has, let's say, a pistol, a rifle, and a tripod-mounted machine gun from World War II, then you have one of two options. Either the pistol is completely meaningless, and the machine gun reaches across the table, and the rifle has a reasonable gamic range, or the pistol is meaningful, the rifle covers the entire table, and the tripod-mounted machine gun can reach a table 2 rooms away. And because of it, shooting ends up being sort of game scaled rather than having any sort of realistic scale. You know, we at some point should sort of have a conversation about the way that game scale works in relation to movement. That, you know, so roughly, as a little piece of, you know, game design mechanics, games tend to measure the width of the table, split it into somewhere between 4 and 6 pieces, and that would be your unit M, and then normal move units move M, fast movements move between 2 and 3 M, and things can shoot 2 M. And there might be short shooting, there might be slow units, there might be long shooting, there might be super fast units.
Yep.
And that's how we break down shooting. And so it means that all sort of modern warfare guns work on a sigmoid curve, where pistols fire way further than they should, rifles are the sort of standard, and all other guns fire increasingly way shorter than they should. And, you know, it sort of messes with immersion. It genuinely annoys non-tabletop wargamers. I've had conversations with non-tabletop wargamers who have considered getting into tabletop wargames, and this infuriates them. And particularly, it makes some
this
people
is the classic bullet drops out of the sky 24 inches after it's left the gun.
Yeah,
Which is, of course, a bizarre way of rationalizing the loss of combat ability. There's other ways to rationalize it, but yeah. And I know people who say, oh, the reason that all gun ranges are nerfed in those kinds of games is so that people can sell more 28mm models. Or no, it's not. It's to make it gamically interesting. It wouldn't, you know, and it's because we're trying to play on 6'4" tables, but. And I think it's not an unfair objection, but that's the more minor of the problems. I think the second problem, and the
probably one of the largest problems is that shooting is really easy to be overpowered. And certainly if you've got a game where somebody min-maxes, every single game where you have a sort of min-maxed army, somebody will turn up with an all-shooting army list. I mean, take as an example a War Machine. So, you know, I picked up War Machine and said to play War Machine. I happen to like pirates. I think they're fun and cool. So I thought, oh, I'll do the pirate faction. And one of the guys in the pirate faction looks like Brian Blessed as a pirate. And so he's like, okay, I'm being that guy. Okay, what does that guy do? Well, because he's like Brian Blessed and has many cannons full of fire like his women, he has lots of cannons. So I built to his system and I ended up with a gun line, pretty much a gun line. And I went to a War Machine event and the person running the War Machine went, oh no, you can't sit back and let the people come to you in War Machine. It just doesn't work that way. And I sort of thought, well, this is a really weird character to write if you can't do that in this game. Let's see. Well, it turns out I can just sit back and shoot because I slaughtered everybody I played without really doing anything, just sitting there going, well, he fires guns a hell of like twice as often as everybody else. He has twice as many guns as everybody else. And you did get massacred running across the tabletop to me.
This is very, very equivalent to the story of when I returned to the hobby in full force and I came to the Canterbury Gaming Club with some Tyranids that I'd painted up. I'd finally got a painted army. It was just undercoated black, dry brushed white, and gloss varnished. But gosh darn it, it was a fully painted army. I turned up and I played a couple of games of Kill Team with a few Gene Stealers, had a good time. And then I was like, all right, okay, let's play a full game of, I think, what was 6th edition 40k at that point. And I laid out my Tyranids, and my opponent, who I hadn't met before, laid out his Tau or his Necrons. I can't remember what it was. And he said, oh, it's, you know, this guy's going to use a power where, you know, they all get extra shooting. And I was like, okay, cool. Wait a minute. And I was looking at the terrain, and there was just a couple of like ice towers, and that was it. It was a blank table. And just turn one just took all my toys off. And I was like, well, I don't really feel like playing this game again. That was my only game of 6th edition. 40K.
Yeah, shooting is inherently really hard to balance in games. And if you give people to put in the amount of shooting they want, it will very often just horribly break a game. And really sort of big, complicated, popular games, very often you go to tournaments and you'll see people with all shooting armies because it breaks that system. And I think related to that as sort of point 3 is it's potentially boring and dispiriting. You know, it is a low difficulty, high reward system for a gamer that requires very basic tactical target prioritizing, and that's all the tactical thinking you have to do. You put down your shooting, you know, maybe you have to find some lanes of fire, but it's pretty rare that you have a tabletop crowded enough to make proper lanes of fire, and it's very rare that the system has things like enfilading fire to turn flanks outside of a unit game. So you really don't even have to worry about which direction you're hitting them from with your shooting. You just make sure you've got the best line of sights that you possibly can, and then you sit there and you tell the other person to take their units off. And I mean, partly in my early sort of career as a gamer, used to gravitate to some of the more close combat sort of based armies. And sure, it's always satisfying when you get in there and pull off the handgunner's head and laugh as you spit down his neck. But you have to have a certain mentality to be able to handle that. Because I know people who play close combat armies and can't handle the fact that if 30% of their army gets taken off before close combat begins, they're doing really well. That's a definite win for you. You're going to crush that. And a number of people I see go completely on tilt when like 25% of their army gets taken off by the first 2 turns of shooting, and the game falls apart because of that. It is a lot of people. A lot of people can't quite get to grips with that. And I think because of that, I'm not saying shooting shouldn't be in games and you just shouldn't have shooting. But I am saying that if you're going to put it in, think really hard about it and how you're going to make it work. Don't assume that either it's going to work or that it works in other systems that do it, because there's a lot of big systems where their shooting doesn't really work very well. And if you go to some competitive matches and some tournaments, you'll see shooting not working in a lot of big games. And I think I'm personally of the opinion, and we'll have some chats about some of the ways to make it work. I'm personally the opinion that you should basically either not have shooting in a game or have the game be all about shooting. So just to get to the next part then. So I think there's probably I probably approach it in 4 different ways. One is to make shooting very underpowered or much less powerful compared to close combat, and we could talk a bit about how that works in Gaslands and how it works in some other systems. It's also very much how I'm approaching the problem in Hobgoblin. There's also the thing that I did in Billion Suns was make ranges very peculiar and sort of force strange shapes out of shooting, which I think some systems do. Then I think probably the most interesting solution is to focus on not the lethality of shooting, but the other force projections that happen as a result of shooting. I think that's probably where some of the most fertile stuff is. And then I agree, like the 4th solution is make it all about shooting. And I think, a game like Adeptus Titanicus, where you are a series of walking gun platforms, and so you build a bunch of mechanics about how is it fun to be walking gun platforms. Like, that's a perfectly good approach to it as well. Yeah, it's like I think Infinity does a really good job of that, where it's the shooting is so everything that the game is about, and it's so
well, and I think that Infinity blends the all about shooting with some elements of the non-lethal thing. Like, it is very lethal in Infinity, but the like forcing people not to walk in certain areas, or when they do get shot, having to use some of their action to like do a dive into cover or whatever, like that creates this really interesting dynamic on the table that I think is very enjoyable.
Yeah, I think in Infinity, because lanes of fire are so lethal a lot of the time, it's a game that is both all about shooting and a lot of the time not about shooting. It's a game, and shooting.
It's a game that is a bit silly to say this. It's a game about not walking in front of the barrel of a machine gun.
Who would have thought such a thing? And
right, which 40K is absolutely not. 40K is like, bring the gun to my face, I will chew on the barrel of the gun whilst you shoot it at me.
Yeah, and it's weird how, like you say, 2 of the most standard ways of making shooting interesting are so far down those 2 ends of the scale. It's like you say, making shooting very, very weak, which is like, well, that's weird, isn't it? If shooting were less effective than close combat, then the way that all combat has gone throughout the history of the world is peculiar, isn't it? It is.
Oh, that solid advancement of the sword as the top of military technology into the 21st century.
Yeah, no, exactly. And it's like, obviously, we've all played games where somebody with a sword runs at somebody with a gun at a fairly long distance, not the whatever it's meant to be, the 13 paces or something, where it's meant to be a sort of 50-50 thing, but like a person with a sword runs at someone with a gun from like 50 meters away, and you're thinking, this is a coin toss. This could go either way. Or if the person with the sword happens to be a character, it's like, oh, that guy with the gun is in trouble. Yeah. It's like, that's not the reality of any situation that anyone's ever experienced. Otherwise, there would be a lot less gun violence and a lot more hammer and knife violence in the
so world. I mean, I'm somewhat inspired because this happens in X-Wing to a certain degree, but it happens even more in Gaslands. Like, in both of those systems, what the most interesting thing is the movement, and so the dogfighting or the racing is like what you want to be focusing on. And so the lethality of the shooting is basically to say, you know, we want to be shooting each other, that's fun, and we want some of these lasers or bullets to land, that's interesting. But like, if the game is just fly forward 2 templates and then everyone explodes, like, there's no game, that's not enough game. And so in those games, like, the maneuvering of things needs to have time to play itself out, and so combat in those games is actually quite ineffectual, which actually, like, you know, we've all, you know, I played a lot of X-Wing and TIE Fighter when I was a kid. Like, landing a laser bolt on something that's moving that way and you're trying to follow it, like, you know, that always felt fairly authentic given the dogfighting situation.
Yeah, the eternal conversation about being able to see a laser coming and exactly how that happens. But you know, it's I know it's a sci-fi staple, but you know, lasers are light. You can't see them coming, because when you see them, that's because they've hit you in the eyeball. But yeah, no, absolutely. And I think in relation,
if it was a high-speed projectile that's somehow reacting with, like, you know, the Higgs field, so that it, even in a vacuum, is still interacting with something, that would explain both the sound and the light.
Yeah,
I'm not sure how it would explain how the sound is arriving in your ear, but
I understand that in Star Wars they are not lasers; they are plasma projections. I've mentioned this. Somebody brought it up, but yeah, sure, they're lasers. In relation to that, and I think particularly in relation to Gaslands and generally, a fourth and far more minor reason is that a problem with shooting is that if you do have a multiplayer system, shooting makes piling on the leader, king making, king choosing, all those sorts of things significantly more of a problem. You know,
yeah, because your sphere of influence as a messing things up type player is just that much larger across the table.
Yeah, certainly playing like Warhammer Triumph and Treachery, you know, an army that has a lot of shooting available and is now out of the game, just finds it that much easier to turn around and mess with other people for the sake of it, and potentially, you know, ruin an otherwise interesting. I mean, there's a whole conversation to have about king making and when it's acceptable and when it isn't. But
yeah, no, I think that's
generally, if you're trying to put a multiplayer system into your game, shooting, you need to be very, very careful about how and where the game ends and when people know that they are or aren't the winner, and the rewards you get for dogpiling whoever's in the lead as well.
So to talk a bit about the one of the answers there, which was the donuts, because I haven't seen this enough, and I think this is interesting. That's why I put it in A Billion Suns. But with A Billion Suns, weapons have a maximum and a minimum range, and what I was trying to achieve with that was to say there are areas within which shooting is very strong, but if you're fast enough and you get inside the range of a unit, then they actually can't target you with their big guns, and they're only left possibly with their smaller guns, which, you know, if you look at the Billion Suns game as it plays out on the tabletop, those short range passive weapons are really like, they're close combat weapons, really. It's a predominantly a melee focused game in its weird way. But I think that saying that shooting is 24 inches gives you this real problem, which is shooting is as effective at 24 inches as it is at like a micron off 0 inches. And there are some games there's plenty of games that mess with this in various ways. One quite common way is to give negatives to extended range. So over half your range, you might get a -1, or at close range, you might get a +1 to hit. And I actually think that's the opposite of the right solution, because what that's doing is it's continuing to punish the melee person who's trying to charge in, even as the gun person got the advantage at range because they could actually attack. And then as the melee person's almost going to get to them, they get double advantage because they also get some kind of bonus for being short-ranging attacks. So I think short-range bonuses or long-range disadvantages is one of those for me, sort of counterintuitive. Well, it feels right, but I actually think it's pretty wrong from a games design perspective. And so donuts is a sort of quite extreme way of doing that, which is just saying like, no, once you're under 12 inches, you just can't shoot. That gun can't track fast enough, or it takes too long to warm up, or, you know, whatever fluff reason you might use to explain that. But I find that's really interesting to have fast, short-ranged troops or ships that can then get inside the range of something. And then you've got a lovely positional game where it's like, well, I've got these donuts of fire and I need to sort of stagger the donuts to make sure that I've got enough coverage so that even if you slip under the radar of one battle group, that I've maybe got a second to cover it. So I think that you could well use that in a, you know, in a squad game or a skirmish game to be like, well, you know, these guns are effective at a certain range, but under that they're just too sluggish. It takes too long to aim. Like once they're too close, I just can't track them fast enough.
Yeah. I think one of the ways of making shooting interesting, and the fallback way I think of making it interesting, is making it part of a combined arms system.
Yeah.
And the classic version of this is shooting is very effective against infantry because it takes them a long time to get in, but it's very ineffective against cavalry because they get there so much faster. Mm-hmm. So your shooting needs protection from a pike block before it gets wiped out by the cavalry, which is actually what happened in the real world. You actually had pike blocks defending shooting. So it's lovely. It's simulationist. And it also means you have to build a combined armed force and you have to use the different units to support each other, which is inherently lovely and interesting and very sort of juicy. Yeah. I think one of the things about shooting is that it's a sort of simulationist thing, but it's a bad idea in a game design, on a game design level. And I think the thing that proves this is that, battles have gone down a very sort of fast evolutionary sort of path, where very, very quickly we've got to the point where there's basically only one sort of, weapon used most of the time in most battles, and it's a standardized sort of assault rifle, basically. And, what we want is there to be one person with a big sledgehammer and one person with two pistols and one person with a sniper rifle. And, we want there to be a mix of these options. But in reality, there isn't a mix of the options, because almost always throughout history, one or another military technology has been dominant. And now we're at a point where one is just so dominant that it just invalidates almost all other sort of weapons and armor. And I think, making a decision about what you want to simulate and how you want to simulate it versus how much you want to make an entertaining game has a lot about your decision as to what shooting you put in and how much shooting you put in.
Well, and I agree with that entirely. And I think to add to that, you've also got what cinema are you trying to create? So, whether it's John Woo or stormtroopers not being able to shoot anything, like there's plenty of reasons why narratively it's exciting that shots miss a lot and that people can survive hails of bullets, or, that Rambo with a minigun can just like minigun down loads of people, but there's still an interesting and tense moment where he might get attacked by somebody else with a knife or whatever. And all of that, I think, is, for me, like that's the cinema that you might be thinking about trying to replicate. And so it's like, well, what are the narrative rules that govern bullets rather than the physical rules that govern bullets?
So I think one of the big ways that you make shooting interesting is by having it be part of a combined arms system. One of the ways I think we're sort of touching on there is the other things that shooting does. So making cover important, creating pinning situations. I think pinning is a much under-featured thing within war games. The fact that you can use guns not to kill people, but to affect the way in which they move, or if they pop up above cover, and the ways in which you need to dislodge, somebody who is hunkered down with a heavy machine gun. On the tabletop, the way you dislodge somebody who's hunkered down with a heavy machine gun is you run through the hail of bullets with somebody who is really fast or hard to kill, and then you just stab him up. In reality, there's a thing about, you know, whether you have to call in an airstrike, or you have to, you know, go around the flank of the position, or you have to sort of, you know, do one or another various ways of dealing with him. I think putting in some of those systems, you know, ironically, for something that we put into games because it exists in the real world, the way that we as designers then deal with it is very rarely the way it's actually dealt with in the real world. It's one of these bizarre things. It's like, well, you've got to have shooting in because shooting exists and this is a battle. And we deal with shooting the way it was dealt with in like medieval and fantasy games. Bows are generally dealt with sort of in the way that bows were dealt with in the real world, with cavalry charges and pikes and blah, 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 and all these sorts of things. Rifles, pistols, machine guns are almost never dealt with in the way that they're actually dealt with in, you know, modern battles. Even in World War I or II battles, it's very rare that a heavy machine gun in a World War I game is dealt with in the way that a heavy machine gun was dealt with in a World War I game. It almost never happens on the tabletop. And it's like, well, if we're putting it in there to simulate something, why aren't we simulating that something? One of the other ways, and I think one of the most basic ways of making shooting interesting is line of sight and lane of fire questions. I alluded earlier on that part of the idea of why a shooting heavy game is tactically interesting is that it's about finding lanes of fire, and about the fact that most tabletops don't have lanes of fire. We very rarely lay out terrain in such a way that makes lanes of fire an interesting question and something that's worth sort of struggling to find. You know, if it's meant to be an interesting part of your game, if it's meant to be part of why shooting is interesting, you know what? Hunker down and put in some serious terrain layout rules. You know, again, terrain layout rules are one of the things that are, in my opinion, most overlooked in
very underdeveloped area.
Exactly. And I think that, you know, in a game, if your game is about how lanes of fire are meant to develop on the battlefield, you know, put some serious effort into laying down how the terrain needs to be set out in order to force people to deal with interesting questions to lanes of fire. Because, you know, I don't intuitively know how to create that battlefield. Most gamers don't intuitively know how to create that battlefield. And if you do, and even if you thought about it, I certainly don't know how to do it within your system. You know, so to help people out, go like, look, okay, for this game to be interesting, it's going to need this sort of terrain in this sort of relationship, in this sort of position, and don't just sort of say, you know, lay it out so it's like a city block. Be like, no, okay, we need X percentage of coverage, we need X percentage of open area, and we need levels, and we need windows, and we need people to be positioned in these sorts of ways, and help people out to make your game sort of a bit, you know, pay out the things that it's meant to do.
I think adjacent to that is arcs of fire, which absolutely isn't a solution, but it's part of adding up to a solution. So, you know, I grew up in 90-degree fire arc realm, and it was kind of annoying to measure and so forth. But having 90-degree fire arcs or corridors of fire that are the same width of your base, or like in Gaslands where you can only shoot forwards, or in Manowar where you can only shoot sideways, or like in A Billion Suns where you've got a very tight 45-degree arc of fire, and because you're moving around quite a lot, like exactly where you end up pointing ends up mattering quite a lot about where you can bring your weapons to bear both this turn and in the following turn, because you may or may not get a engage order on them. So I think restricting the arcs of fire to corridors or small windows I find to be quite interesting, because it forces interesting questions about the movement phase and what decisions you make in the movement phase, which I ultimately find to be a satisfying cocktail. Now, you know, if you have designed a game where it is actually an acceptable strategy to just line up your troops at the back and then shoot everything as the enemy walks towards you, then arcs of fire aren't really a solution to that. You've got another problem to solve, which is your game is rewarding sitting still rather than forcing interaction or, you know, objective capturing or whatever. Which I think that's probably a topic for another day, is like how to force players to actually engage with the game in a meaningful way. But you know, notwithstanding the baseline gunline problem, I think restricting arcs of fire so that it's quite difficult to bring your guns together in a situation that's quite dynamic, I find more interesting than the 360 line of fire skirmish game standard behavior.
Yeah, no, absolutely. When I sort of, I think like you, I sort of came through the era of 90-degree lines of sight, and the first
because everyone was cast as a square, so
yeah, you know,
we never even questioned where
that's normal.
was.
You can't do that. That's not a natural thing to do with a gun, and you know that's weird. But it does mean that I always remember sort of an interview with the snooker player Ronnie O'Sullivan, who was talking about going off and playing pool sort of during the off season to make some money. And he said, you know, because being a professional pool player versus a snooker player, it's just about potting. You just pot things. You know, it's a sort of a non-game in many ways, you know, to a professional snooker player. And sometimes I feel that way about skirmish games with 360-degree line of sight. It's just about picking things and shooting them. There's no actual sort of tactical weight there. It's just going, well, here's my priority list. That's top of the priority list. Shoot that. Shoot it. Is it dead? All right, move down the priority list. Continue until I get to the bottom of the list and I've won the game. Yeah, I really do think that there are a lot of casually 360-degree line of sight, moderately powerful shooting, you know, games, and
there are problems with that.
They are problems. That is an issue. Those systems have ways in which playing them is not brilliantly entertaining. And you know what? The final thing to consider is maybe don't put shooting in your game. Maybe your game doesn't have shooting in it. It's not a literal necessity, even in a battle game, even in a massed warfare game. It's not an actual requirement in every single game. You know, I wouldn't judge you for leaving it out. You know, maybe you should consider just dropping it off. Maybe if it doesn't make things better and more fun, maybe drop it out, maybe make it non-fatal, maybe make it more interesting, you know, maybe make it about how things get maneuvered, get positioned, you know, get shoved around. Reconsider just putting in a load of people with, you know, the ability to reach out and touch everywhere on the tabletop.
Yeah, maybe it pushes units backwards. Maybe it places templates that you can't go within because they are scary areas. Maybe it gives people a resource that they have to shrug off before they can choose to do the thing that they were going to do.
Yeah. Seriously consider making your shooting either non-fatal or not about its fatal consequences. Think about how it deals with lanes of fire and cover questions. Don't put it in casually. Be aware that it is, despite its ubiquity, a heavy weight to put on the scales. In actuality, we're casual about it as designers, but it is a spicy meatball. It is something that needs serious consideration, and it is something that you should respect more than, frankly, a lot of games, I think, in my opinion, respect and make that consideration.
Glenn, I enjoyed this conversation. I wasn't sure where this was going to go to, but I think we found quite a lot of fertile ground on this one. That I perhaps hadn't added up all of these things to I am highly suspicious of shooting phases, as you had jumped to. So yeah, thanks for this.
No problem. Okay, if you are a huge fan of shooting phases, tell me why I'm wrong. You know,
we'll hide behind cover.
At least tell me where your favorite, because it's the thing, there are good shooting phases, there are good games with tons of shooting in them, there are a lot of good games with tons of shooting in them, there are a lot of games with bad shooting phases and bad shooting and game ruiningly levels of bad shooting. Tell me what your favorite game with good shooting in is. If you love shooting in a game, tell me what your worst games with shooting in and where shooting has just ruined an otherwise excellent system for you.
And sometimes fireballs count as shooting.
Yes, lots of things counter shooting other than a firearm. Tell us your position on shooting in games, either way. If you're struggling with it in your game, I know that some of you are designing games, you know, right as you're watching these videos, and I know that some of you are struggling with shooting specifically in your designs. Tell us about the things you're struggling with. Tell us about the solutions you've come to get around them. You know, there's a conversation to be had. We're more than happy to have it. And, you know, if you want feedback, if you want opinions, please drop it into the comment section. Drop into our comment section, you know, speak to us, talk to us about what you're thinking. Other than that, you know, reach out to us on social media generally. If you've watched the video through to this point, please do like and subscribe. It's lovely to know that you enjoy what we're doing. But other than that, I think it's going to be thank you and goodbye from this episode of Rule of Carnage. Thank you and bye-bye.
Bye.